I almost pulled off a seamless transition. Then my foot got caught in the cord here. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
This is a kind of a tradition of mine, I think, to give a message on Memorial Day. Back in Michigan, the church I was at, the pastor often took Memorial Day off. They had a family reunion that day. So usually I was the plan B for that day. So it was good to have you all here. Hopefully you'll enjoy this morning and what we have to share. So let's go ahead and start off by saying, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the hunger of memory, or your Spanish lesson for today, el hambre de tu recuerdo. And the reason I picked this, it's not just because I get hungry right about this time, and hopefully that won't happen to you. Of course, now that I mention it, it might. But I wanted to kind of give credit from where I got this, because I'm really not smart enough for a pithy saying like this. I'm good at ponderous, but pithy, not so much. This is a book that I read back in the 1990s. It's called The Hunger of Memory by an author by the name of Richard Rodriguez. And this was a kind of a memorable book for me in many ways, because the author was a Chicano scholar, Chicano Mexican-American, that lived in California. And he was writing about the fact that when he was younger, he was immersed in Latino culture, in the Mexican-American culture of California. And then he found himself able to achieve in school. And as he achieved in school, he sort of wandered or left or moved. I kind of like the saying from one of the songs earlier, not all who wander are lost. He kind of moved from that into the world of academia. And in doing that, as he went on and graduated from college, graduated from graduate school, became a professor, he moved further and further away from his roots, leaving the language of Spanish behind. Didn't really associate as much with the people from the old neighborhood or the old culture, and kind of traded what he was for this new person. At some point, he sort of realized that he'd left some of those roots behind and was realizing that he wanted to reconnect. He'd even left his religion behind. He was sort of drifting into agnosticism, where he had been a loyal Catholic when he was younger. So when I read this in the early 90s, I sort of resonated with it, because it sounded a bit like my story. Because I'd gone through a similar path, starting off living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, growing up there, and getting, as I moved academically through life, having more distance from my roots, and distance from the language, and distance from the culture, distance from the people. And it almost seemed like an inevitable path. And when I read this book, he was saying he wanted to try to reconnect. And that's what kind of gave me the idea to try to reconnect. So it started my efforts, which started in the 1990s and have continued on, to sort of reconnect with my roots. So that's why I stole the title of the book. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. All that was just a freebie so far. A lot of times we have memories of things. And we have memories that are so strong, they move us, just like hunger pangs can move us. They move us to make decisions. They move us to have thoughts and attitudes and emotions. And they move us in directions in life sometimes that we don't always realize. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the memory that the Bible talks about and some of the hunger of memory that's in the Bible. Not every bit, but some that kind of stood out to me. And so I'm going to kind of move through that. And I've got several scriptures. In fact, I've got a total of 8 scriptures today. So I'm not going to ask you to stand up each time unless you want to. It's fine. John, I don't want to blow out your knee again. Okay. So it's up to you. But I'm going to read 8 different scriptures today, just kind of giving you a heads up. When I read this book also, I became a student of culture in a lot of ways, which, somebody who's already immersed in education, who'd already gotten a lot of mileage in nuclear engineering, a third thing to study would be just wonderful. And so culture became sort of my third thing to study at that time. And I've been a student of culture ever since then. So I've got a handout in the bulletin. And the purpose of the handout is not to distract you, although that could happen. The purpose of the handout is to help you connect with the material in kind of a different way, an alternative look at things, if you will. So if you find it helpful to engage with the content in that way, feel free to do that. If you find it helpful to do it afterwards, you can do that too. If you find it helpful to put it aside and ignore it because it's distracting, I invite you to do that as well. So I'm going to talk about three different types of hungers of memory, three different types of memories that I've observed in people, in the church, in culture, that I feel the Bible has something to say about. One of it is the memory of better times that weren't really better. And the reason I say they weren't really better is because the reality is they probably were practically indistinguishable, or they had their pros and cons. But somehow when we look backwards at things, we think, oh man, those were the good old days. Wow, did we really have, things were really moving. I was younger, more powerful. I had hair, Michelle. And you sort of look fondly back at those. The Bible kind of warns about that. So that's one type of memory that I think drives us that I want to talk about. Another is the memory of how one was once closer to God. And this is a memory that I've seen in people as well, where they realize that back when they were younger, they were closer to God. Now, not so much. And younger, I don't mean to say younger could be your 20s. Younger could be when you were a teenager. Younger could be when you were in elementary school. Younger could be when you were in your 50s. Depends on where you're at now. But just younger, when you thought you were closer to God when you were younger. And now you kind of see, gosh, something's moved. Something's happened. Something's different now. So we'll kind of look at that as well. And then the third type of hunger of memory is the memory of how God moved in your youth and how God moves again. And I hope to kind of tie this in with what's happening in our church later on today. So I'll get to that. But that's when you realize that God was at work. It's kind of different from the other two because God was at work, and you recognize God was at work, and you still wonder, you see God at work today, and you think, is there a role for me? Is there something I can participate in? And that hunger of memory, I think, is a very real one as well. So those are the three things I'm going to talk about. And so I'm going to go ahead and read this first passage, and this is from Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 8 through 10. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. This is Solomon, of course, writing this. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. So the wisdom of Solomon. And I think what he's saying here is to let life play out a little. Don't jump to the conclusion that things were better when you haven't seen the end of life. You haven't seen the end of your own life or the end of the life that God has for the church or the life that God has for this church or the life that God has for our nation or that God has for our world. Because we look for a glorious future. That's our hope. And so to start looking at the good old days sometimes makes you angry, and it refers to it in this passage. Because you think, why? Why isn't it as good as it used to be? And sometimes it's because you remember really well how good it was. Like, for example, I had an athletic career once upon a time, but all the people that are witness to that are either 1,500 miles away or dead. So I can probably say anything I want to about my athletic career, and no one's going to know any different, right? So everything looks better. Sometimes I wake up at night, especially when there's the NBA playoffs right now, I wake up at night thinking, I just went down court on a fast break layup and laid it in, and it felt so good. I felt the wind rustling through my hair. It was wonderful. And then I wake up and I think, oh, that was a long time ago. And sometimes you might get angry. I said, why? Why is my body broken down? I still try to work out. Why are things betraying me? Why isn't it as good as it used to be? And I sense some of this anger sometimes in our culture when people get frustrated with why things aren't as good as they used to be. It doesn't mean that you can't try to do something better, but the anger part is part of it, and part of it is the lack of patience, thinking that the best days happened already, and now I'm just coasting through the rest of my life, or we're just coasting through the rest of our history. So being able to value the beginning before you see the end is what Solomon says is not a wise thing to do, to look back. Well, you probably remember this.
From Television City in Hollywood.
Boy, the way Glenn Miller played.
Songs that made the hit parade.
Guys like us, we had it made. Those were the days.
And you knew when you were there.
Dance girls and men were men. Mister, we could use a man like Herbert Hoover again. Didn't need no welfare state.
Everybody pulled his weight.
G.R.O. LaSalle ran great. Those were the days.
So I had to, I went ahead and explained this to the teenagers today in Bible study because I felt like I was on the History Channel talking about, this anthropological mystery called All in the Family. But that was a very popular TV show. In fact, that was probably one of the most popular. The other one you just saw a hint at was another one, highly popular show. This one was biting satire at a perception of the good old days, that there was one person in the middle, the man in that clip, that thought those were the good old days and we'll never see those again. And he was constantly fighting to recapture those. And everybody around him was saying, no, those really weren't so good. and that was kind of a lot of the whole talk. And it was a stand-in for, I think, some of the things that America was going through at that time in the early 70s, trying to think, have we seen our better days? Is it done? Can we recapture our better days? And we have no ability to have a vision for new better days. Except for his wife. She could kind of see both sides of it. And she's probably the most interesting character if you ever want to go back and watch those old episodes. But there were hints in what that song talked about. When it talked about girls were girls and men were men, and you see that comparison between the two things. Okay, was that a hallmark of those days? And when he said, guys like us, we had it made, well, what does he look like? What is his skin color? What is his religion? What is his economic class? For that person, guys had it made. But if you weren't in that group, did you have it made? When they said that we didn't need a welfare state because everybody pulled his weight, people did pull their weight. Some people couldn't pull their weight, and they sank and drowned. And we've kind of moved to a society where we try to care for each other, even caring for people that we don't know. It's interesting that some of the biggest debates now about health care are really based on how Christian should we be? How Christian should we be? Should we try to take care of everybody as much as possible or kind of find a balance in there? But that's a far cry from letting everybody pull their weight and letting people drown if they need to. Sometimes we forget how much we've moved as a culture in a biblical value like that until we kind of think about it a little. By the way, there was a live episode of that show that was shown on network TV this week. So if you have Xfinity and you want to go back and look at a new cast doing a couple of classical episodes, they're there. But this one that I kind of gave you a hint about was another big nostalgia craze that came in the 70s. And this was, the pilot episode was shown on a show called Love American Style. And then it became its own TV show called Happy Days. And this was also a monster hit. And this was not biting satire. This was truly a fond look backwards at the 50s and the escapades of people from that time period. And at least around me, all the people that were older than me, that were in their 30s and 40s, that had lived through the 50s, all really enjoyed that show. Regardless of who they were, they really enjoyed that show. It's interesting, as I was watching the pilot episode for this, it's on YouTube. If you just Google that, you'll find it. It's interesting, some of the things that I noticed. First of all, you can already see the seeds of God being kind of moved out of American culture in that pilot episode. There's an older son who's saying that he's in college and he's taking a philosophy class and it's making him question whether there is a God. So even at that time, even though prayer was kind of involved in the show, you still saw that. You saw surprise when there was an African American that showed up in the house of this family, that the man of the house was surprised to see a black man sitting in my chair, because that was not a normal thing for that time period, for that household. When the teenagers seemed to all be talking about who they could kiss, that seemed to be all they were after, and they were very single-minded in that. And you look at that and you think, well, I hope there was more to those times than that. But that occupies an awful lot of that pilot episode and some of those early shows. So to give a little bit of a contrast to that, I wanted to talk about somebody else. And this is my great-uncle Luis Soto. Now, I'm just going to take a minute and ask how many of you in here are veterans of our military service? If you could stand, please, I'd appreciate that. Let's give them a hand. Thank you for seeing a better life ahead of you for yourselves, for your family, for our country, that you dedicated yourself to service for the years that you did. Now I'm going to ask, how many of us know of somebody in our family who died in military service? Just raise your hand if you know somebody. And you can go all the way back to the Revolutionary War if you want to. Okay. So for those of us, this is somebody I want to talk about, somebody from my family, my great-uncle Luis Soto. And he was all of 19 years old when he died in Okinawa in World War II. And so a few of you are close to 19, right? A couple of years, one way or the other. Just think about, it's done at 19. I mean, that's hard to think about. It's hard to talk about, hard to imagine. But it was true for many of our soldiers in World War II and other wars. And again, my great-uncle Luis gave his life for a country that he saw the hope for, even though he didn't experience the reality at that time. He was looking ahead to a hope. And that's why you go to war. That's why you defend your country, because you have a hope for better things. Even as good as things may be, you have a hope that better things are coming, and you're willing to die for those better things. And for some, and hopefully many soldiers, you even look ahead to eternity, and you know there's something better in line for you and for everybody in eternity. And walking into eternity isn't such a scary thing when you have that hope. So my great-uncle Luis was what we call a birthright citizen. And that's probably how all of us are American citizens. We were all born in this country, and by virtue of being born in this country, we are citizens. What's interesting about my great-uncle Luis is that his parents are what we would call undocumented immigrants from Mexico. So he was the youngest of 7 children. Well, they had more, but 7 that actually kind of saw the light of day. He was the youngest of 7 children. And the oldest was my grandmother, and her parents brought her into the United States when she was about 2 years old. So in today's terminology, we would call her a dreamer, because she didn't really have a choice. She came with her parents. And they were seeking a better life in the United States. And they had the rest of their children who were all American citizens by birthright. So he was the youngest of that group. He was not in the draft, but he did sign up. So he volunteered to go into the Army. And he was in war probably about a month and a half. He was deployed in around April 1st of 1945, and he passed away May 17th. So he saw 48 days of combat before he passed away. But the world he lived in was a lot different than those happy days. The world he lived in, the United States he lived in, had about a 2% Latino population, and in World War II, about a 3.5% Latino population in the military, which means that Latinos were overrepresented in the military, partly because maybe they wanted to fight for a country, but partly because they saw maybe some opportunity to escape poverty and a poor socioeconomic background. The military that he served in was a segregated military, which we don't have anymore. But what that meant was African Americans were not allowed to serve in combat roles unless there was no other choice. They were not eligible for promotion, because if you know the military, kind of doing dangerous things and being successful is one of the things that gets you promoted. So if you're never given the opportunity to do dangerous things, you never really get the opportunity to be promoted. Thankfully, that ended a few years after World War II when the Army was desegregated. But that was the Army that he was in at that time. And the world he lived in didn't really know how to classify Latino people, so they looked at them white, but talked a funny language, ate funny food, didn't really have a place for them. So he was sort of out of place in that country and in that military at that time. Sometimes people forget that the United States has had a long history with Latino people in particular, just like we have a long history with African Americans. And our dealings with African Americans and bringing the slave trade in, and then the freedom that was given in the Civil War, and then the long period of civil rights struggle is part of our national heritage, something we all understand, just as much as we understand about the Pilgrims or any other aspect of our national heritage. And with Latino people, sometimes we study the fact that the United States acquired land in the Mexican War in the middle of the 19th century and forget that they acquired people too. And when that happened, we ended up with a people group that were on both sides of a border that they did not create. And since then, we've had this interesting relationship with Latino people, kind of a come hither, go away sort of deal. Like in the middle of the 20th century, and this is where a lot of the old-time Latino population in Indiana comes from, and that was from the Bracero movement, which was when the war came and people had to go, men went into the service to fight. In the factories, they needed people to work, and a lot of women filled the void there. A lot of African Americans left the fields in the South and moved into the North and started working in the factories to help with the war effort. And so the farms had a dearth of laborers. And so one of the agreements that happened in the 1940s was to ask for Mexican laborers to come in, temporarily work the fields, and then go back home. Come hither, go away. The problem is when you have a group like that, and they come, and they make decent money, and they see a land with maybe a little more opportunity than where they had before, it's kind of hard to tell them, okay, go back, your time's up. Our law says you can stay now and no further. So a lot of them stayed. And that became kind of the basis for a lot of the immigration that's happened since then. And that's the reason why, even though the Latino population was 2% during World War II, it's like 20, heading towards 20% right now. A huge increase. But it started there. So we've had this interesting history. One of the things that we don't always realize is that this, the country that Luis Soto lived in wasn't always friendly to him or people like him. And I think maybe some of you have seen some of these pictures. The only reason I put these up is because these are local. I mean, there was national pictures of the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the middle of the 20th century, in particular in the 1920s. It was strong here in Indiana and in Hartford City. And it's something that, when I was talking to the youth about it this morning, they're very much aware of. Although they still have some questions, they're very much aware of it. And these were people that believed that America was best for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And if you were Catholic, if you were Latino, if you were African American, if you were Chinese, if you were Japanese American, then America wasn't the place for you. If you were Jewish, America wasn't the place for you. And that's what, just to kind of show the kind of the power of this whole thought, the gentleman over on the right, I don't know if you recognize him. His name is George Stevens. He was an engineer and perhaps the wealthiest person in Hartford City in the 1920s and 1930s. He passed away in 1940, so he came to Hartford City kind of in his middle ages. He died in 1940, and after he died, people realized he was actually black. He had spent his whole time in Hartford City and before pretending that he was white. Now, the reason you would do that, especially if you were a person of means, is because you realized, even with the money you had, that if your social standing would be impacted by the color of your skin, you would lose even what you thought you had that was pretty solid. Right now, we think of rich people as, wow, they got it all. But in those days, that wasn't enough. And so he pretended to be white, and people didn't find out till he was dead that he was black. It just talks about the fact that when you have someone like Luis Soto and other people like him, African Americans, white Americans, Japanese Americans who were looked at with some revulsion during World War II because of the possibility they were all loyal to Japan, that all fought in the military. You look at Navajos and Native Americans who had a long history of mistreatment, but also fought in the war. All of them fought for the same reason. They saw a greater hope, a better hope for their country, and they wanted to see that happen, and they're willing to put their lives on the line for it. So my great thanks to everybody who has served in the military, because I think you have to have that hope in order to do that. And nowadays, we also remember first responders because they have a similar idea. The first responders come in without thought of their own safety to try to help other people. So a lot of times we think about Memorial Day, even thinking about people who are first responders. So I don't know if anybody knows, if you have a family member who's a first responder who died in the line of duty, but if you do, be sure to thank the family members remaining from them because they served us quite well as well. So one of the things I want to suggest is that we resist the temptation to look longingly on the past. And this is a discussion I had with Pastor Tom, because he gave a message a few weeks ago where he talked about the cross being preached in the middle of the 20th century, that was kind of a good thing, and it was a good thing. And when the cross is preached, it is a good thing. When the cross is preached to a segregated congregation in a segregated culture, that's not reflective of what Jesus is all about. And Pastor Tom and I both agreed on that. So just to remember that sometimes when we look longingly at the past, there is a mixture in there. Some stuff is good, some stuff's not so good. And maybe what comes later is what we need to look forward to. So this is a passage from Numbers 14, and it's probably something a lot of you maybe have run across before. It says, "So all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried." And these are Jews. They're in the middle of the desert, and they're wondering, boy, things aren't so hot right here. We're kind of short on water and supplies, and we're a little lonely out here, and we're kind of wandering around and not sure what the heck's going to go on. So it says, the people wept that night, and all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? Even though we were slaves back there, hey, at least we were alive and we had food." They've kind of forgotten things, right? Because they cried out to God when they were in Egypt for rescue. So they said to one another, "Let us select a leader and return to Egypt." And so that's the temptation, I think, that we want to resist. And that's going back to days that maybe weren't as good as we remember. Because sometimes when we remember things, we remember the good stuff and not so much the bad stuff. Like the first time we went to watch The Karate Kid when we had a young family. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a great movie. And we start watching it, and there's all this foul language. I'm thinking, holy cow, I don't remember any of this. I just remember, that. Or then we watched Back to the Future. So this is a great movie, and you get to see a cool car. And again, it's all this cussing and swearing. I thought, well, I don't remember all that stuff. Sometimes our memories do that. They obfuscate some of the bad, and we remember the good. And it's hard to kind of keep our focus on the future. That's what happened to them. So that's one of the hungers that I hope we'll be able to resist, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So the second hunger is the hunger of memory of how we were once close to God. And this is from Psalm 42, verses 1 through 4. And so I'm going to go ahead and read this. It says, "As the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, while they continually say to me, 'Where is your God?' When I remember these things, I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go with the multitude. I went with them to the house of God, with the voice of joy and praise, with a multitude that kept a pilgrim feast." So clearly, this is a remembrance of a good time in the past when you were closer to God. Different than what I just talked about. This was legitimately good times in the Lord, and you're not there right now. And you're wondering, what happened? Where did I lose something? Where did I go off? This person is seriously depressed, just in case you were curious. If you ever eaten tears as hunger, that's seriously depressed. Okay, so that's pretty clear. Well, do we have any counterparts like that? Occasionally this happens. And occasionally this happens right in front of our eyes, and we don't always catch it. But I'm sure you recognize this. This is the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, France. And just recently, there was a big fire at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And so there's a before and after picture here. The before picture is on the left. That's what it looked like for many years. It was first built about over 900 years ago. It didn't always look just like that on the left, but at least for the last 150 years with that spire, it's looked about like that. And then on the right, now there's some scaffolding that was up. You see that, so kind of ignore that. But you notice the roof, that white part, is gone. You notice that big spire in the middle of the one on the left is gone. Those are destroyed in the fire. It was everybody recognized it as a tragedy. In fact, there was great grief while the cathedral was burning. People gathered in the streets and wept as they watched this national treasure they thought was going up in flames. And when they did that, there were some realizations, because remember, a student of culture, there were realizations that people thought of this as the soul of France, and that when it went up in flames, they made them remember, we've gone a long ways from those roots. Our ability to make that kind of a building is long gone. But even more important, the motivation, which was the glory of God, to make that kind of building is long gone. And there was a lot of people thinking that this was kind of standing in for France maybe having lost some of its Christian soul, some of its Christian roots in the decades and centuries since that building had been built. And in the days right after that happened, there were pledges from some pretty rich people to pledge like 100 million, 200 million pounds, which is a lot. A pound's a little more than $1. It's a lot to rebuild it. And the president of France said, we're going to rebuild this in 5 years, because there was a desperate desire, okay, we got to get this thing back. We didn't realize how good we had it until we lost it. One of the criticisms about the cathedral was that the government, who was in charge of it, hadn't been taking very good care of it. That scaffolding that you see there was for repairs that were long overdue. And in fact, those repairs were sort of the part of the reason that the thing caught fire, if you missed that. So that was that realization. Now, here's an interesting picture from the inside. And that is, oops, did I miss that? I was going to show you one right there, but it's not there. It's a picture, is it on this? Okay, I'll just talk you through it. It's an interior view of the cathedral, and on the left side it shows about a year ago what it looked like, and on the right what it looked like after the fire. What's interesting is on the left there's hardly anybody in there. For the national soul of the country, there's hardly anybody there. And having been to some of these cathedrals, I know that you can go in to a service and not have to pay the admission fee. So it's when you see a lot of people in a service, a lot of those people are tourists who are staying for the service who don't want to pay the admission fee to get in. So in this service, from this picture that I can't show you, there's not that many people there. So it's kind of like we've had something, we've taken it for granted, and now it's gone, and now we realize how much we miss it. And sometimes our faith is that way. T.S. Eliot kind of made a reference to this, talking about our faith sometimes is like an old cloak, and we repair it, and at some point we decide we're too good for it. We've advanced in life, we don't need to wear shabby clothes, and we cast it off, we send it to Goodwill. And somebody else who needs a cloak picks it up and fixes it and wears it. And sometimes our faith can be that way. We feel like we've outgrown it, or it doesn't suit us anymore, or it doesn't look good in front of other people. So we get rid of it, or we hide it. And that's kind of what happened with the Christian soul of France. So this passage in Revelation is kind of an interesting passage, because if you recognize it, this is Jesus talking to the church of Ephesus. And he says, in Revelation 2, 4, and 5, nevertheless, I have this against you, that you've left your first love. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent and do the first works, or else I will come to you quickly and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent. Now, with the youth on Sundays, we studied the book of Acts, and we know that Ephesus doesn't really exist anymore. So that church eventually did stop. That city eventually did kind of fade into history. And sometimes when we see a lampstand being removed, we think of something big, like a big lightning strike, or maybe God blowing a big wind and blowing out the lampstand, blowing it over. We don't realize sometimes the natural course of events constitutes a lampstand being removed. So in the cathedral here, you look at that, and you look at how beautiful it was on the left and the wreckage on the right. And this is not Reuben saying, oh, God was judging France for their turn away from Christianity. Not saying that. But the removal of a lampstand is something that can happen before our very eyes, and we're not always cognizant of it. And I hope that, and this story is still being written, I hope that somehow the people realize who their God is, and don't just rebuild the cathedral, but rebuild their Christian soul as well. So the key is to go back to your first love. And when I think of first love, no offense to my wife, I try to still show love to her. But our first love, I went overboard. I think she drowned in all kinds of stuff that I sent her way, things I wrote about her, things I sent her, gifts I gave her. She doesn't remember any of it? Yeah. That was you. So, we've done a lot, over the last years, but I don't do nearly as much now as I used to. So maybe this is a kick in my rear end as well. So that's the challenge, to repent or the lampstand is removed. So here's the third type of hunger. And this is the hunger of how God moved in one's youth and still moves again. And this is, let's see, I think there was a scripture verse there. That was Ezra right there, right? Okay. Sorry about that. I'm going to have to read from, so if you give me a sec, I'll pull this out. And this is Ezra chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. And this is when people are coming back from Babylon and they are starting to rebuild the temple. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah talk about that. And what happens is they're starting to rebuild the temple. This is the glorious temple that Solomon had constructed, that David had gathered all the materials for. And they're going to rebuild the foundation. And this is from the book of Ezra. As they start to do this, he says in verse 12, "But many of the priests and Levites and heads of the fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this temple was laid before their eyes. Yet many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the sound was heard afar off." And so these next two pictures sort of illustrate that. The one on the left I could not find the credit for. It's just kind of floating on the internet. The one on the right is from a very noteworthy Bible, the Gustave Doré Bible. That was the illustrated Bible that was produced in the middle of the 19th century. It has just a ton of illustrations. Probably a lot of illustrations that you think of when you think of classical illustrations of biblical stories that aren't paintings by Rembrandt or Michelangelo or somebody like that. Might have come from Doré's Bible. In both of these, the guy with his hands up is Ezra. And in the one on the left, you can probably see, imagine a little better. There's the two laborers, and then in the middle are the older people that are weeping, and then in the back are the younger people that are rejoicing. And it said that they couldn't tell the difference in the sound. And that's because the older people remembered how God had moved. They remembered that temple and how glorious it was, and it moved them to tears to see that the rebuilding was happening. But the young people, they weren't there for that other temple. They were thrilled to see God at work, that this thing that nobody thought was going to happen was going to happen. They were restored, and they were going to rebuild their temple, rebuild their city, rebuild their kingdom. They just didn't see that coming at all. So so there was that mixture of weeping and ecstasy. And this is a great illustration of that hunger of memory of God being at work. When you sometimes think, yeah, God was at work when I was young, and I don't know if maybe I'm just too old now. I don't know if I can do this. Or maybe I'm just too burnt out. Maybe I've had some hard experiences in life, and I'm not able to contribute or do what I used to. And those feelings can happen at any age. They're not the exclusive domain of people with gray hair. But sometimes you might think that and think, again, the best days of me and God have kind of passed. And here's a scripture, and apologies, it's not up there. This is a scripture that sort of helps it kind of talk about that. And this is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. This is where Paul talks about, and he's talking to the Thessalonian people, and he's giving them encouragement in this. So this is verses 13 through 15. And he says, "But we are bound to give thanks to God always for you, brethren, beloved by the Lord, because God from the beginning chose you for salvation through sanctification by the Spirit and belief in the truth, to which he called you by our gospel, for the obtaining of the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you were taught, whether by word or our epistle." And so he's telling them, the stuff that you learned that were biblical truths, stay with that, in spite of all the things that you're going through. Stand fast in that. And that's exactly the thing that I want to remind us. If you felt like you saw God move in this church, let's say we had 18 good years with Pastor Tom Parsons, and now we're going to have a new pastor coming in. And if you thought, how could we do any better than those 18 years? Entertain the thought that the best years of this church lie ahead. The best years of your faith still lie ahead. So that's I think, the encouragement that Paul leaves the Thessalonians with. So let's see. A good example of this, by the way, are the 1984-85 Los Angeles Lakers. Bet you didn't think I'd go here. But I'm a longtime Laker fan. And this championship team, this is the team that beat the Boston Celtics, finally ended a long-standing curse that the Lakers couldn't beat Boston. They beat them in Boston. If you're a Celtics fan, I apologize. But this team, these three guys here in the middle, Jamal Wilkes, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bob McAdoo, were veterans. They, longtime veterans in the league. People that were past their prime. They were key contributing members of this team. The team couldn't have done what it did without them. And then you had this guy named Magic Johnson, Michael Cooper, and Ronnie Lester, Mitch Kupchak, Kurt Rambis, Larry Spriggs. Those guys were like the veterans that were in their prime. They were the ones that were in the peak of their career, and they were able to contribute a lot. They carried the team. They were the guys that kind of bore the brunt of the success and played the hard defense and everything else. And then you had these other guys, Mike McGee, Byron Scott, and James Worthy. And these were the young guns. They were just been on the scene like a year or two. But the team needed their energy and excitement and enthusiasm and their good basketball play. This team couldn't have won the championship without all three of those groups of people. They needed all three of them. And they needed the older people to buy into the fact that the best years of this team were ahead of them. They needed the young people to be guided by them. It's interesting that millennials nowadays tell us that they want the opportunity to work with older people. They don't want to displace anybody. They want to work side by side with older people. And it's the other thing I just want to kind of remind you, when we talked about All in the Family, when America seemed like it was coming apart at the seams back in the late 60s, early 70s, God responded with a revival, the Jesus movement. That was just what America needed to be able to turn the tide. And I think many of us, I'm guessing, probably are somehow descended from people that became Christians or renewed their Christianity during the Jesus movement of the late 60s and early 70s. So what I want to leave you with is a couple of challenges. How to satisfy the hunger. No, this isn't really what I had in mind. But I thought these were interesting ads about hunger. They are chosen specifically because they do sort of talk about stereotypes a bit. But what I wanted to do really is talk about the challenge. That Pastor Tom gave one challenge. I'm going to try three, so we'll see how that works. Let's see. Go on. There we go. Here's the first challenge, and that is to satisfy the hunger. First of all, start listening to this podcast called The World and Everything in It. Now, you know that's a QR code. You know if you shoot your camera at it, it'll send you to the website. If you don't know that, now you know it. It's also in your handout. The World and Everything in It, I find it's a refreshing way to get a thorough digest of the day's news, but without all of the baggage that sometimes other podcasts. It has a Christian perspective, which I welcome, but it's not. It's if you like NPR style, it's NPR style. But what I like is that it's got serious news and it's got hopeful news. It shows God at work in the world. And it gives me hope every time I listen to one of these podcasts. Yeah, there's some crummy stuff going on in our culture, but there's some really cool stuff that's just around the corner. And that's what I love about this podcast. The second one I'm going to suggest, and that's if you don't know someone in your family that died in the line of duty, if you didn't raise your hand just because you couldn't think of a name, or if you have somebody who was a first responder who died in the line of duty, then maybe take a minute and find out who that person might be. You might have to ask somebody, and you might have to maybe risk a phone call or a social media, and a Facebook message or something. But see if you can know a story about somebody that you know, because I think it's important, because they're not here anymore, and they live on through our memories and through our repeating the stories to the people that we know. And they also, like I said, set an example for us because they gave their life for a better future. And then the third challenge is sometime today, and this might be hard for some of you. I don't know if Hazel's out there. This might be really hard for you. Ask someone older than you what they think is stronger about their Christian faith today than when they were younger. So talk to somebody and say, how are you a stronger Christian now in 2019 than you were in 1979 or 1969 or 1989 or 1999 or 1959 or 2009 or 2015? What is it that's stronger about you? Because I hope that, first of all, we all have something to say about that. And secondly, I hope that if we don't, it'll encourage us to find something we can say about that. Amen? So those are the 3 challenges. We're going to have a song to exit, and then we'll call it a day. So thank you.